Last term I was asked a question about writing a critical essay, so I'm going to take you through some of the best approaches that you will need to be able to write a really good critical essay in an exam. And I'm going to start with structure, and this is a question that comes up reasonably frequently both for novels and for plays, because both a novel and a play rely on the structure of a plot to be able to reveal a complete story and do it in a way that's satisfactory for a reader or an audience. So bear with me, because I'm going to start by taking you through how the structure of a novel or a play should work and explaining to you some of the key terms. This diagram gives you the narrative arc. You might have come across different names for it, you might have come across different names for the components, but you'd be familiar with the idea that the tension ought to rise towards a certain point and then fall in order for it to be emotionally and intellectually satisfying. You might be familiar with the terms rising action and falling action, which you can see within the structure of this diagram. Exposition, conflict, turning point, climax, resolution, dénouement. I'm going to take you through each of those in turn now and give you some of the formal analytical information that you need to be able to talk about them and sound as though you know what you're doing. So exposition starts at the beginning. It's usually the first chapter, it's usually the opening of a novel or the first scene of a play, although it can sometimes be a little bit later, and it's then done in either flashback or a sort of narration explaining what we have seen, but it's usually pretty near the beginning. The term exposition means, as you can see from the word exposing, so it's about setting forth or explaining where we are, who the characters are, what's happening. It establishes narrative voice, and the narrative voice of a novel particularly is really important. Are we talking about a third-person omniscient narrator, or are we talking about a first-person narrator who is one of the characters? That's often really important because it determines how much of what's happening in other characters' heads your narrator is able to interpret for you. The exposition should introduce key characters. We should see who this story is going to be about. It should reveal themes. What is this novel about? Is it a novel about friendship? Is it a novel about loss? And with particular themes goes associated symbolism. So if you take The Great Gatsby, the symbolism of Gatsby's hope, possibly groundless hope, that he will be able to rekindle his relationship with Daisy. You've got the green light on the end of Daisy's dock. So symbolism often goes hand in hand with theme. You might start to see that during the exposition of the novel. The exposition establishes setting, both in time and place. So if you're dealing with a particular period of history, you should learn that quite quickly. And it should engage the reader's curiosity and empathy for the characters. So then we move on to conflict, and without conflict there is no plot. Anybody who has no conflict lives happily ever after from the beginning of chapter 1, and a book is really boring. So conflict is essential. Which characters are going to experience conflict? And in the best books there's more than one, and quite often those conflicts become involved with each other in a way that makes a plot more complex and allows for the development of subplot. What's the scale of the conflict? Are we talking about global warfare? Are we talking about national upheaval? Are we talking about a domestic conflict within a family? Are we talking about a character whose conflict is largely internal, and it's a battle between what they know they should do and what they feel they are able to do? Hamlet would be a good example of internal conflict. And what are the sources of that conflict? Is your character engaged in a battle with the gods? Is he or she a helpless victim of fate? Do you have the sense that some greater power is playing chess with this character's life? Or is it like 1984 that the character is in conflict with the government and the established order? Are they in conflict with other characters? Are they in conflict with their own morality? Is there something that they want to do but know is wrong? And as we start to see the establishment of conflict, that's when you like to know that there's hubris at work. that our character, who is otherwise very likeable, has some flaw which is going to bring about his or her downfall. And what are the catalysts? What are the things that speed the conflict along, that hasten it, make it inevitable, make it more intense? Then we reach the turning point, sometimes known as the pivotal scene or a moment of peripeteia. And at that point, the fortunes of the protagonist change. From believing that it might all be alright and he might make it in the end, it might now become evident that he's destined for destruction. Or it might be that a character who has battled against apparently insurmountable odds now begins to see a glimmer of hope. That turning point can work either way, but we see the fortunes of the protagonist change in a way that starts to move us towards the conclusion of the novel. And quite often here we get a glimpse of the outcome. It can sometimes be dramatic irony, so we realise it but the character doesn't, or it could be something that we will realise with hindsight was revealed to us and was a foreshadowing of the ending. Sometimes this can be a distressing realisation. Either the character realises that they just haven't got the quality they need in order to achieve what they want, or that fate has so stacked the odds against them that they haven't a hope. Quite often, this is a moment of hamasha, a moment where a character makes a decision which proves to be fateful, and that can often be the turning point of a story. From the turning point, we quite frequently move straight to the climax, and that is where the protagonist experiences the worst that can happen. For some, not all, it's death. For some characters, it's suffering more profound than death. The loss of Daisy is far more traumatic for Gatsby than the moment where Wilson shoots him. Possibly you could argue that for Othello, the knowledge of Desdemona's innocence and the knowledge of what he has done is the climax that is the worst that can happen and is actually more intensely and acutely painful for him than his actual suicide. So you've got all sorts of things that can happen that can be the climax of the novel. It's the culmination of all the tension that any good writer has built up. You could argue that narrative tension is all about making the reader wait for something, or making the characters wait for something that we can see is coming, and it torments us when it hasn't happened yet. And quite often novelists will then change the narrative focus and go away and spend some time with another character while you're desperately waiting, leaving a cliffhanger. At the climax, it happens. Whatever it is that you've been waiting for happens here. It's the high point of emotion, whether that emotion is positive and you're exhilarated on behalf of your character, or whether it's dreadful and you suffer agonies with them. It's also the resolution of dramatic irony. Anything that we knew about the character that he or she didn't know about themselves, we see it working out here. And from the climax we move on to the resolution. The resolution is the end of conflict, full revelation of all the themes, where we see the moral lessons clearly. Macbeth, at the point where he says, "Before my body I throw my warlike shield," he's reached his resolution, but he goes out fighting. There's that end of conflict, and the moral lessons and what's to be done are clear. And then you reach the dénouement, which is a French word for laying everything bare, and it's the final unravelling of the plot, the restoration of order, and an ability to see the protagonist clearly. If I use the example of Macbeth again, that restoration of order, this is Malcolm's inviting everybody to see him crowned at Scone. It's a sense that order is restored. The world has gone back to rights. What it was that was wrong has been dealt with. He talks about Macbeth as this butcher and his fiend-like queen, so we see clearly what Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have become. But by the end of that last scene, there's a sense of peace restored in Scotland. That is the dénouement, the final unravelling of a plot, where you see everything, all the loose ends tied up. Now, having taken you through that narrative arc, it all feels quite tidy, and we know that novels are not always like that. A narrative may not be a linear, this happened and then that happened and then this happened all the way to the end. We're occasionally treated to things that happen in flashback, which explains something that you're seeing now possibly. Or you might find that the narration is episodic and that scenes are extracted from a character's life, not necessarily in a chronological order. Or you might have a framed narrative which is a tale within a tale. So at the beginning, one of your characters sits down to tell the story of his childhood, and when he's told the story of his childhood, the plot progresses from there. But the important thing, having looked at non-linear structure within a novel, is that you probably can still see the narrative arc, and that actually the timing and the placing of specific elements of the narrative doesn't usually affect that overall sense that we're progressing towards climax, resolution, dénouement. So that takes you through the elements you're going to write about. And you need to know your own novel that you're writing about well in order to be able to do it, but hopefully that helps you to start to sit down and look at your novel and say, okay, now I recognise that up to this section is exposition, this reveals conflict. You could start to be able to analyse any novel from this basis. And I just want to think for a minute about how you write an essay for real impact on your marker. The first thing you need to do is to have a clear answer to the question in your mind, but also in your introduction. So if the question is something about writing about a novel that has an effective introduction or an effective opening chapter, you need to start off with a clear idea in your head of why that novel fits that question and how you're going to prove it. So, novel X by author Y does have an effective opening chapter because it performs all the functions of exposition. Using techniques 1, 2 and 3, and your techniques you write about might be characterisation, symbolism and description. They might be something totally different, but you can talk about techniques, and usually for higher in Scotland the question will ask you, in fact I think it almost always asks you to focus on techniques the writer uses. So name 3 techniques you're going to use. Then you could say that it's effective because it engages the reader's empathy for character Z and evokes curiosity about his or her fate. That thing about saying it evokes curiosity is a good way of saying it hooks you. It makes you want to read on. It makes you want to read on doesn't sound academic enough, but to say that it evokes curiosity sounds a little bit more sophisticated. Then through the main body of your essay, you need to work your way towards that answer methodically. Deal with the functions of exposition that we've talked about here, so establishing setting, establishing characters, introducing themes and symbolism, establishing the narrative voice. But while you're doing that, talk about the techniques that do it. And while you're doing that, evidence everything from the text. So while you're talking about characterisation, pick on some adjectives that are used to describe the character or some epithets that are used. Use as much evidence as you can to prove that your answer is grounded in comprehensive knowledge of the text. If you generalise, you won't get the top band marks because a general answer doesn't have that absolute conviction that you know this book inside out. Conclude it effectively. So start with a phrase like, clearly it can be seen that, or thus, or something that shows that you are now drawing together everything that you've said. Sum up the points you've made without introducing any new material, and if there's a quotation in the novel which encapsulates your argument, end with it. It leaves a lovely lingering sense that this novel is worth talking about if the last words are the words of a character or the words of the author. The last thing I've given you here is a list of vocabulary to use for structure essays. I haven't given you definitions. One of my mantras as a teacher is that I'm not doing all your thinking for you. These are some of the words that you need to be using though. So look them up, familiarise yourself with them, make sure that you're integrating them into the structure of what you are writing. And if you have any further questions, leave them as comments and I'll see what I can do about answering them.